Um, but Reedy last week gave this really great monologue at the end of the show, talking about how everything in HVAC is a range. And it made me think of MeasureQuick in particular, where you've got this spectrum that things could be, and there's a certain area in this case where it's good. Now, in the case of sizing, it can be pretty wide. Depending on the house, it might be small, it might be big. We don't necessarily know, but it's a range. And if you don't have some extra information, thinking that you
be wide.
Yeah, well, yeah, it should be a range, and it shouldn't be like it's 51,275 BTUs.
I like how this illustrates that the range, if you measure, is really tight.
Yeah, where you want it to be is so. And well, this is for equipment. It's got these really small green spots here, and this is an older version of MeasureQuick, but I always liked this display. So what we'll talk about next week is what we call likely load range, which is if you don't understand what the load of a house is, it's going to fall in a fairly wide spectrum. So like for this, I was just imagining it between 1 and 3 tons. And the goal of likely load range, which is a calculation that is just about to hit the HVAC 2.0 software, it's next up. We're trying to, if you think of a bell curve, cover the vast majority of what's under the curve. So 90 or 95% of likely heating and cooling loads is what we're trying to do. And it's going to vary. So like if you have an older home that's leaky, it's probably going to lean towards the higher side of the spectrum. Not always, but probably. Because like when it comes to blower door testing, every so often when you hear somebody say, I can predict what the house is walking up to it, like you haven't run enough tests.
You haven't done enough blower door tests.
Yeah. It's Kevin. Why can't I think of his last name? Up in Minnesota. Ted, do you remember his last name? Inspector? Auditor. My mind's blanking on his last name.
But I was having a conversation with Austin today about this, and he told me about a house that he was on, and I'm like, oh, so the leakage was somewhere around this. He's like, how'd you do that? I'm like, well, because you gave me energy use and square footage.
Yep. Yeah. Those two numbers are enough to back into it. Yeah.
So those are really helpful. But then I told him some stories about because when you're doing a blower door test every day on houses for hundreds of days, you go to the house and you get the energy use first and you get the square footage, and eventually you start to see patterns and you're like, oh, okay, so I think the blower door is going to be somewhere around this. And a lot of times you can get pretty close. And then
within 10 or 15%.
Yeah. And then sometimes you're a long way off and you're like, okay, so, like baseboard heated houses can be really leaky and still not have high energy use.
Yeah, because they don't have the forced air messing with stack effect.
Yeah, right.
So there's all these different factors that go in. So if you picture older homes, it might lean towards the higher end of the spectrum. Newer homes might lead towards the lower. But what we can dive into next week, and hopefully Tim can be here. He's on vacation this week. So Tim Nahr of Nahr Heating and Cooling in Lancaster, PA, he ran, these are 2 of his projects that he worked on, and check out the variance in the load here. So the shell of these houses is identical except for air leakage. It's the only thing he changed. So he clicked in average air leakage and came up with a heat load of a little over 40,000. Loose came up with just shy of 50,000, and then put in what the actual blower door was of almost 6,000, 5664 on an 1,800 square foot house, and came up with a 78,000 BTU load. So if you put in low, you are 30,000 BTUs low. Or if you put in loose versus what the actual was. So
so if you put in average, you're at 40,000. And if you put in actual, you're at 80,000. So it's double. This house was double of, if you had guessed average, you would have been
half.
You would have been wrong for us the other way by half.
So it's pretty wild. And we can talk next week about what it does to cooling loads as well. So like this moves things around, but when you say you're running a load calc and you don't know leakage, there's a lot of risk here.
There's incredible variance.
Yeah.
That the load range you have to put in if you don't know infiltration is big. That's
exactly. So you're going to have these big ranges. So if you think you're running accurate load calcs, unless you are going back and checking with something like an Ecobee and watching runtime, or some of the train thermostats that will track runtime, but they show you how many hours per day they're running, which isn't quite as useful. You want to see the gaps how long the equipment turns off. But if you aren't checking that, I'm saying you're sized wrong. And I've checked enough that right now I win. I'd like you to win, but you have to go check. And so if you can start making like an Ecobee thermostat your standard thermostat that you put in, and see what happens. So for free quotes, when you don't know that much about the house at the end of the day, ranges are your friend, not so much saying it's this.
If you do a range, you can say to the homeowner, based on the information you've allowed me to collect, this is likely load of a house similar to this.
Yeah. Yeah. So ranges are what we're suggesting, thinking more so than but when you have a number that is 5 digits long, it gives you false certainty. So that load might be 51,263, but reality could be anywhere between 32 and 75. Like it's a really wide range. Ted, I see you putting up J trammels. You'd be able to see that much leakage if you walked around and crawled around the attic and crawl.
Yeah, so I don't know who does that. I would much rather just put a blower door and then guess. And I don't know anybody that can guess that accurately based on a house they've never been to before, based on seeing a couple of holes.
Yeah, I've had some just blow my mind.
On that? Tanner, you're up.
How good are you at guessing blower door walking up to a house, even if you get to walk, if you get to crawl around it?
Somewhere between not too good and maybe all right.
Yeah, I think once you've done 100 blower doors, this is a skill that you can a little bit develop. But if you've never done a blower door, there's no way you can do it.
Yeah.
Would you agree, Jeff?
Yes.
Which to me is like knowing that there's the possibility of that outlier where you walk around, it's an older house, you walk around, you see some obvious things, and it's like, oh, I bet this is going to be leaky. And then you test it, and it's like a lot less than what you would have thought. It's like that one just always, to me, it sticks out. And so even though I can go into a house and you can look and you can make a guess and you can be like, I feel like it's going to be here. And you may be right a portion of the time, but there's those ones that when you're off, you're going to be really off. That makes you go, okay, it's not even worth, like, it's so much easier just to test.
And ethically, telling the industry that they could guess and guess accurately, do you see a problem with the ethics of suggesting that?
So my guess is, if I'm understanding what Jason is saying right, I don't imagine that he's suggesting that this be the standard practice, is that you crawl around in the attics and guess. I think what I took away from what he said is that if a house is that bad, sometimes you'll notice it. Like if the leaking is that bad, like sometimes you'll notice it. But in a general, sense, of course, you have to run a blower door to get accurate or get like a more precise range of loads. But sometimes when a house is really bad, you'll notice it. And unless you notice it that bad, you're better off running a blower door test, is what I think he's saying.
Cindy Zeiss says it's so much easier to just test. I agree, Tanner. So you go, buddy. Now the bad part is you can't test for free.
Ken, do you have a comment on this? You've done a number of blower door tests.
You're on mute still.
You can have a good-looking house that's leaky, and you can have a crappy house that's tight.
Yeah.
It's been your experience.
Yeah.
You've been surprised as many times as you've guessed right.
Yeah. You'll get indications sometimes from the homeowner that it costs a lot to heat our house. And we should be looking for something. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a sign.
But that still doesn't give you a number.
Yeah, that's. I mean, I've had a couple of old houses that blew my doors off for how tight they were, and I've had a couple of new houses where I'm just like, what the heck is wrong with this thing? And then I had one old house in particular that I think of. I audited it and I didn't know where all the leakage was, but it pulled a 9,000 blower door on a 2,700 square foot house, and my first comment to the client was, "There's got to be a window crack somewhere." There wasn't.
Wow.
And I still don't know exactly what that was. My dogs are barking at somebody driving by here. But there was one wall in that we tore it apart, and I still don't know what the leaks were, but we knocked 1,400 CFM50 out of that for one wall that we hit that I still don't know exactly what the leak was. I was like, let's tear that off and just foam the whole thing and we'll see what happens. For reference, our house in Ohio had a 730 blower door. So that one wall had leakage of double what my entire house in Ohio did. And I don't know what the hell it was. So you can definitely get your doors blown off. And we'll talk next week about the one key thing that does is it messes with your latent load.
So Jay, I think what you've helped us come to the conclusion is, which we haven't really arrived at until now, probably people that aren't going to do blower door tests, we should tell them that they need to do 100 blower door tests before they even think about making assumptions or guesses about infiltration. And in the meantime, they should stay away from guessing at infiltration. And I think that will probably make it to onboarding. What do you think, Nate?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So thank you.
That's perfect because it's important. Here's a great comment Jay's putting in. Newer houses 1995 plus are usually worse than 1950 to 95 houses without crazy chimney chases and the like.
Sometimes that's happened. Like you go through these periods where the houses really have, like maybe in a neighborhood, they built really terrible houses. And then in the neighborhood right next door, they built great houses. And you're like, what is going on? Oh, Nate actually did a builder's daughter's house. And the builder built beautiful houses.
It's gorgeous.
It's
a lot of spray foam.
Quality builder. What'd you say?
He had a lot of spray foam in it. Yeah, and the requirement for code, if you tested, was 7 ACH 50, which everybody knows it's not one of my favorite numbers. But the only reason they hit that number is because they have an 11-foot ceiling in the basement. If it wasn't for the extra 3 feet of ceiling height there versus what it would normally have, it would have missed 7. For reference, my house at the time was 1835 build. It was a 7.4.
So brand new house from
it's a terrible
perspective. It was a basket case.
Yeah, what a train wreck. It was gorgeous.
Jeff, the house we visited when I came down to see you in Indiana, and I don't want to name the person's name, but the nice lady's house, she bought that from a builder, didn't she?
Yes.
And it was full of mold and stuff at the time, or something like that, if I'm remembering right.
Yep.
Yeah,
that was
what this.
Same thing. Oversized equipment, just that guessing, that rule of thumb. New build. So.
And that house was actually tight, right? It was just the return that was screwed up.
Yeah, correct. So twice the size of the equipment needed, and
no return.
Ductwork issues. Yeah.
And there was mold coming off of like light fixtures and stuff, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yes. Yep.
That one was wild.
Whole lower level. They ripped out the whole ceiling, so it was gone when you got there. You didn't get to see it before.
Oh boy. Well, we'll come back to this and dive in deeper next week. But this is a challenging thing. Yep, you moving
was
along
that
there.
me? Sorry.
Yep, that was you. It's all good. I was just clicking through. We both went to switch slides at the same time.
Thank you guys. Thank you everybody for who
Great
showed
comments.
up. I'm gonna end this, and we can all
One
go.
quick second, Ted, before you end this, Nate, can you go back a few slides to that slide about repair, not replace? I want to ask a question. We can tee it. That might tee us off for a future episode. Not now, because I know it's pretty late.
There we go.
This one, yeah. Something Ted said, I've been thinking about it since then at this slide, is about like, how do you bake in the right processes and stuff from the foundation of your business? And I'm putting myself in the shoes of a small business owner, right? And in crunch times like this, when you're staring at bleak numbers like this, you said either you lower price or you innovate, basically, is to try to find more value. And Ted talked about how do you bake in like new processes like Sandler or a different sales process, a different way of doing business in the beginning. I think it might be worth really exploring what that actually looks like for a small business owner. Like, what does it mean to innovate? What does it mean to like change your business model? What does it mean to actually go from like, replacing and switching like for like to like repairing or like a different kind of business model? And what do those changes look like? Who needs to be trained? Who needs to be informed? Like, how do you make those changes? How do you make those steps? Like, I think it's a little opaque to a lot of people. I don't think they understand that really well, and it might be worth unpacking in a future
There's
episode.
some best practices, like don't have selling techs.
There's other things, but still, Abhi, I think that's a wide and a deep subject. So yeah, let's get together and brainstorm that, and have a round table on that. I like that idea.
I don't know who Brian Feeney is, but we could invite him.
Yeah, Ben, can you do an email intro for me on that, please?
Yeah.
And yeah, we can go for that. I've seen his number kicking around, or his name kicking around, but I don't know him yet. And Jay, there you go. Abhi's always coming up with the good ideas. So it should just be Abhi's show, and we'll move on.
Yeah.
The Canadians are taking over. Revenge for 1812 or whatever the year that was.
We can't let this happen.
I'm going to close this on 2 minutes of Reedy last week, and we'll go over to the after party.
Sounds good.
Thank you all.
Ranges. HVAC operates off of ranges. The voltage range is in the 190s up to 250. The capacitor range is plus or minus 10%. Airflow is all over the place. Temperatures, set points are all over the place. We had to ask ourselves, if we're against a range, a likely load range, then why aren't we that way in everything else we do with HVAC? Charging even has a range. There's no absolutes in HVAC, not one absolute. And so the problem really lies not with anybody but the contractor who's doing the load calculation and saying it's exact when it's really not. It's almost as if they know that they're not telling the truth, but they're going to do it anyways just to cover themselves.
Or to make themselves look like they're some kind of a magician or more professional than they are. Or
Recording in progress.
Range. It's a range. Everything in HVAC
Recording
is a range.
Stopped.
And if we're professionals in servicing and fixing and all this other stuff, then we should also be, and that's professional to have a range.
It's professional to have humility.
Right. We should be equally professional in having range unless we're going to do the things that are necessary to tighten that range up really, really tight.
Very good point. Very good point.